I am David Frankel, and I'd like to talk to you today about an early Bronze Age spindle whorl from Cyprus. The whorl we'll talk about is P8422. It comes from excavations we carried out at a site in the centre of the island called Markialonia. It's about 4,000 years old, give or take a generation or two. We can see it here, both in the photograph and in a drawing, which gives a good idea of its size and shape. It's about the size, maybe a little smaller than a standard matchbox, and you can see it has the incised decoration and a central hole where it was attached to the spindle. You'll also note, of course, that the photograph and the drawing are not the same way up. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One's a fairly mundane one, and that is that it's very hard to balance a whorl of this shape on the narrow terminal. But more importantly, this picture gives an idea of something else, which in fact is a clue to the way in which this spindle whorl was mounted and used. If you look at the top of the spindle in the photograph as it's presented, you'll see something interesting. This is use damage. It happened during the use of the spindle, and that's what shows us how it was used, and that it should be, in fact, seen the other way up. For it's a low whorl spindle. The whorl is at the bottom of the spindle, and the damage comes in the process of using it as the bottom of the whorl hits the ground. We can get someone to help us see this. This woman comes from a site of Ambelikou, a Bronze Age site elsewhere in Cyprus. She's a bit schematic, perhaps not quite what you'd expect a person to look like. We see her here in drawing with her decorated clothes and necklaces, and the spindle with its low whorl we've drawn next to her. We'll redraw her so it gives a clear idea of what's going on. And here she is, with the raw material in one hand on its distaff, and the thread coming down to the spindle with the whorl at the bottom. She's dropping the spindle, and as she does so, she's flicking it so it spins. And as it spins, it draws out and twists together the threads as they drop toward the ground. And then they're bound around the spindle. As it hits the ground, perhaps that's where the chipping and damage occurs. So she's using a low whorl drop spindle, part of a particular way of working. During the early and into the Middle Bronze Age in Cyprus, spindle whorls changed their size and their shape to some extent. Part of this is just perhaps to do with fashion, but also it's because there's a functional, practical aspect. Small, light whorls are best for spinning fine threads from short stapled wool. Wider, heavier whorls, which will spin more slowly, are better for spinning heavier wool and flax for making linen thread. We can see this through the number of whorls of different sizes from our excavations at Marquis. The earliest periods, whorls of this particular biconical shape, tend to be quite small. That is, they're used for spinning fine threads. Later, the time when our spindle whorl, now a more conical shape, was used, we get a slightly wider array of weights. So people are not bound to just be spinning fine threads. They may be spinning heavier threads. And as we move towards the Middle Bronze Age and into the Middle Bronze Age, many whorls are bigger, although there are still some small ones. People now are more consistently spinning flax to make linen thread as well as the wool. The thread is then taken and mounted on a vertical warp-weighted loom, as we see something like the one in the picture. We know this because we have a lot of loom weights, heavy, roughly shaped clay weights to which the warp threads were attached, holding them down, keeping them taut while the weaver could work. So our threads are then woven into cloth on a vertical, warp-weighted loom. It's not the only type of loom that was used in the ancient world, for there are different traditions of spinning and of weaving, different times and in different places. We know something of the cloth that was woven from several items. The most recently described and discussed comes from a tomb on the north coast of Cyprus. It was excavated over 100 years ago, although it's only recently been studied. Here we have a metal knife that, when it was deposited in the tomb, was wrapped in cloth. And as the metal of the knife corroded, it mineralized some of that cloth, so we still see it, a sort of fossil imprint of the cloth in which it was wrapped. And this gives us an insight into aspects of the woven fabrics. It's a linen thread with an average diameter of about 0.5 millimeter. It's woven with a plain weave, where the horizontal threads, the weft, pass under and over alternately at right angles to the vertical warp threads. There are about 14 threads by 18 threads per centimetre. In an Australian thread count system, this would be a thread count of about 100, perhaps towards the lower end of modern sheets or tea towels. Different textile techniques and traditions, characteristic of different times and places, take different forms. We've seen the low whirl tradition in Cyprus, but elsewhere people used high whirl spindles. If you grew up learning from your sisters, your cousins, your aunts, parents, how to spin, if you learned those techniques and tricks, ways of handling the whirl in a low whirl tradition, you'd have a great deal of difficulty switching to a high whirl tradition and using a different whirl in a different way of handling things. High whirl spindles, people using high whirl spindles would have had the same difficulty switching the other way around. They're the warp-weighted looms we've seen, but elsewhere people use ground looms, where the warp threads are stretched horizontally rather than hanging vertically. In the ancient world, about the time of our spindle whorl in Cyprus, we have a low whirl spindle and a warp-weighted loom tradition in Anatolia, that's Turkey, to the north, and Greece and the Balkans towards the northwest. Elsewhere in the east and down towards the south, toward Egypt, we have a different tradition where people used high whirl spindles and ground looms. So Cyprus is part of that northern tradition. Well, let's put it also into context of time within Cyprus. Our early Bronze Age in Cyprus starts about 2400 BCE, plus or minus a little. There are earlier people in Cyprus. We call them the Chalcolithic, but names like Chalcolithic and Bronze Age are just archaeological conveniences made up a long time ago by archaeologists, and we tend to stick with them, although sometimes they're more of a problem than they are something of use. There's a long-lasting then Chalcolithic tradition, ways of living, ways of doing things, economy, technologies, social traditions. And then we have the development of what we can think of as a Bronze Age tradition, which would last many hundreds of years from its initiation, with, of course, minor changes within it. Our spindle whorl is part of that early Bronze Age tradition. It's part two of a tradition which we don't have earlier. The Chalcolithic peoples, as earlier people in Cyprus, didn't use clay spindle whorls or loom weights. If they were spinning and weaving, they were using a different technique and a different tradition. But now in the early Bronze Age, characteristically, we have the clay spindle whorls and the loom weights within that northern tradition. It's not the only change that takes place in Cyprus at about this time. And we'll look at a few of these other changes, other innovations. One of them is the introduction of animals that were not there before. Chalcolithic people didn't know about cattle or about horses or donkeys, but in Cyprus, now we have in the early Bronze Age the introduction of donkeys and cattle. And we can see a difference if we look at the proportions of different animal types at some Chalcolithic sites and in early Bronze Age, such as at Marquis. In the earlier periods, people were hunting deer, they had pigs and sheep and goat were the primary animals whose bones we find in sites. But then, in the early Bronze Age, many more sheep and goat, and of course, the new species, the cattle and equids, in our case, donkeys. So we see a shift in animal husbandry or the way of using animals. Animals are also used for other things as we move into the Bronze Age. Not just for their meat, but also in other ways. One of them is to pull ploughs. Probable that in the Chalcolithic period, agriculture was hoe-based. People were tilling the soil in that way by hand, and this limited the areas that people could farm. But then, with the Bronze Age, we have the introduction of ploughs, particularly a type of plough which we call a single-handled sole-ard plough, as we see on this model scene from a Bronze Age site in the north coast of Cyprus. As with spindle whorls, there are differences in different countries. Cyprus, once again, is part of a northern or northwestern tradition, where the sole-ard ploughs are common. Elsewhere, other types of ploughs, such as two-handled ards, are what was favoured. So once again, we see Cyprus fitting in to a particular cultural tradition. Larger areas that could be opened up, now more expansive agriculture using a plough, meant larger crops. These were harvested in Cyprus using a new type of sickle, where the sickle blade consisted of a series of sharp flint blades, such as these. And also, the wheat and barley produced was ground into flour using querns with upper rubbers, very heavy ones. There's a higher proportion of these in the Bronze Age sites than there are in Chalcolithic ones, and they tend to be somewhat bigger. So people are working harder, producing more flour, perhaps larger populations, certainly using areas which may have not been particularly productive for Chalcolithic people. Food, whether from animals or from other agriculture, wheat, barley, and other fruits, nuts, and the like, was prepared in a different way in the Bronze Age. Chalcolithic people, and this might seem a little strange to us, but then the past is always somewhat strange. Chalcolithic people didn't have cooking pots, but part of the Bronze Age introductions were an array of different types of cooking pots, purposely made, particular technology and shape, and so on. And they were used for cooking, set up on little hobs or pot stands behind the hearths. And maybe they were for making stews or soups or porridge, things which Chalcolithic people didn't eat, not part of their cuisine. Those hobs or pot stands, here are two examples on the left from Marquis, have reminiscences of a type of stand and hearth that we also find in Turkey to the north. So once again, that's a connection, a linkage to particular areas. Pottery types too change into the Bronze Age. And in fact, archaeologists often use pottery types to distinguish different periods or different social or community systems. We have the introduction of incised decoration, such as was on our whorl or seen here on the jug, where lines are cut into the burnished other surface to create the patterns. But more interestingly, perhaps, is the fact that this jug, characteristic of the earliest Bronze Age, has a handle. Chalcolithic people didn't use handles on their pots. They held them in a different way. Now in the Bronze Age, they could pick them up by handle and use the handle for pouring and carrying around and the like, much as we do with our jugs, cups, and the like today. So there's a very different way of handling and doing things in the Bronze Age from the earlier period. Just everyday, unthinking, unconscious aspects of how people handled the things that they used. And among the things they handled was their babies. Here we have a Bronze Age mother with her baby and a few other babies. They're all wrapped up on cradle boards. They could be carried around or perhaps left in the cradles to sleep while the mothers got on with some other task. This is very characteristic of the Bronze Age, but probably not of the Chalcolithic. We can see this because we can identify the effects of being strapped into a cradle board it had on babies' heads. It creates a flattening of the back of the skull. We don't see that feature in Chalcolithic burials, but it occurs frequently enough on some of the burials of the Bronze Age. So people are handling both their pots and other things in a different way, and handling their children in a different way. This is small-scale, domestic, everyday activities, showing differences in the way people do things. Where they did them also changes. Their built environment is different. Chalcolithic people had characteristically large, round houses. In the Bronze Age, a different system applied with multi-roomed rectangular houses, and this had effects on how people worked and connected and interacted both within the houses and between houses in the village. So the whole social structure and the spaces within which people carried out all those daily activities changed, or was different in one period from another. Another difference is the introduction of a more developed and sophisticated metalworking tradition. We have some indications, in increasing number, that Chalcolithic people occasionally used copper. Cyprus, as we know, is almost synonymous with copper. It was a major source of copper supply in the ancient world. But in the Chalcolithic in Cyprus, copper was not significant, but it becomes so in the Bronze Age, with an introduced and more sophisticated and complex metalworking tradition. So we have then a wide array of innovations from about 2400 BC, give or take a little. There are changes, as we've seen, in artifact types, in animals and materials used, techniques, technologies, and so many aspects of everyday domestic behavior passed down from generation to generation, unthinkingly, unconsciously, ways of doing things. And I think the best way to explain this is there was a movement of people to the island. People came, and as we've seen, the links seem to be to the north. They came to the island bringing with them all these different ways of doing things, their own ways of doing things that they were comfortable with. And then there was these evolved as people settled and developed within the island. But that, of course, raises a question of why did they come? Well, perhaps the answer is to be seen in that metallurgy, that last aspect I talked about. These new types and techniques, where we have here an example of a stone casting mould. It was broken and reused in a wall, and one of the earliest walls at our settlement at Marquis. It was used for casting axe-shaped ingots that could be transported, they could be traded, they could be moved within the island, and they could be moved elsewhere. At that time, mid-3rd millennium BCE, there was an interaction system linking the Near East, southern coasts of Turkey, the Aegean and Greece, an interaction system. Copper and tin were part of this, and we now know that Cyprus was connected into this system. Copper and tin was being moved around, both on land and perhaps by sea, within this system. And so it's possible that looking from the south coast of Turkey as we are here, people could see there dimly on the horizon, as you may be able to see, the misty outline of the north coast of Cyprus. People who were interested in mining, processing, and transporting copper might have thought, let's explore, let's prospect. Maybe there is copper on that land to the south. And they had the seagoing technology, the boats, to enable them to go there. And perhaps then we can start to see prospectors going across to Cyprus and looking for new sources of copper. So we might have then 2400, 2450 BC, a period of exploration and prospecting. People interested in copper looking for new sources, and this would have been followed by first smaller settlements perhaps, and later expanded settlements, but not just of individual copper-working miners and processors, but whole communities. Okay. Because you needed an agricultural base, the food support, the community support, in order to exploit the copper sources properly. So we have perhaps a settlement based initially on exploitation of copper, bringing whole communities who settled and expanded and developed within the island. Well, that's one side of the story. But of course there is another side to it. What about the Chalcolithic people? What was their reaction to these newcomers with their different ways of doing things, their strange animals, their different techniques, their different traditions? What was their reaction? What sort of interactions developed between these two communities? What adjustments did the Chalcolithic people need to make? Or indeed, those who had arrived. So this is then a very interesting question. How are we to understand not just a process of arrival, but a process of relationships between communities with very different ways of living in the world? There are many questions and puzzles within this for future researchers to explore. As these two communities interacted, what processes of adaptation or acculturation or assimilation, hybridization some might suggest, what processes were involved where these two came together to create what was then, at least archaeologically, to be seen as a single cultural system? This is a really intriguing question. Once we have more sites of the earliest Bronze Age in Cyprus, more sites of the latest Chalcolithic in Cyprus, perhaps we'll see some aspects, archaeologically see some aspects, of this process of interaction. This has taken us some way from our initial Spindle Whorl, but it's all part of the same story, a complex story of disentangling little bits of evidence and see broader pictures within them, as well as their small scale ones. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little exploration. And if you're interested in following up any of the technical details, there are a number of references here to the particular aspects that I've been talking about. Thank you.